As we find ourselves in the midst of an undeniable resurgence of interest in psychedelic plants and compounds, a number of pressing issues have become apparent, both within psychedelic communities and with regards to how psychedelically minded people engage with broader human issues. In recent years, large schisms have appeared with regards to how people engage with both broader human issues as well as psychedelic-related plants and the associated issues. Amidst this groundswell of psychedelic ideation and engagement, the crafting of psychedelic memes or easily parsed snippets of information seems to have outpaced critical examination of their underlying claims. Over the past decade, at least, it appears as though some people have flocked to psychedelics owing to a certain romanticized notion. That is, psychedelics seem to be chic and exotic because they blend the mixture of cultural taboo and transcendental promise. Currently, you can find countless YouTube videos of self-proclaimed prophets and experts extolling the virtues of psychedelics. We even see people committing biopiracy and pushing all sorts of solutions completely divorced from reality. Unfortunately, this is only the tip of the iceberg, as psychedelic gurus offer lessons on ascension for exorbitant prices, continue to perpetuate systems of biopiracy, and ultimately seem to be pushing dogmatic frameworks. Perhaps it's unsurprising that we're seeing this, given the nature of the dominant culture of industrial capitalism, but it seems like something worth discussing. As a jumping off point, I'd like to present a few assertions about the world in which we find ourselves. There we go. In order to provide some context for the ideas that I'd like to share. First, we find ourselves at a point in history where we are both witnesses and participants, willingly or not, in global ecocide. This is largely the result of industrial civilization, capitalism, and their associated systems and institutions. Second, through direct experience, psychedelics can affect radical shifts in perspective on personal identity, mortality and trauma, relationships between itself and nature, and holistic understandings of interconnected systems. Third, whether talking about ayahuasca or other entheogenic preparations, there's a wide range of psychedelic practices spanning the globe, and most, if not all, of these practices are in constant flux. And finally, realizations, whether psychedelically or otherwise induced, do not equate to action. Ideas must be tied to consensus reality via action in order to have an effect, just as proposed strategies for change must be rooted in structural analysis if they are to be taken seriously. The reason I feel it necessary to start off by pointing to the global ecocide is twofold. First, it's a stark reality of daily life, and therefore part of the foundation for any examination of current events. We're currently experiencing its unfolding, and it's likely one of the most pressing issues facing humanity. Second, it frequently comes up within psychedelic communities and is all too commonly used to make assertions that are completely at odds with reality. For example, at a recent conference, one psychedelic celebrity repeatedly proclaimed that perhaps the ongoing ecocide could be a blessing in disguise because it might force us to unlock our latent psychic abilities. As to the question of what these psychic abilities are and how they would actually affect the systems responsible for the current situation, there were only vague mentions of telekinesis and corporate greenwashing, with no actual presentations of how these supposed abilities would disrupt the mechanisms responsible for where we're at. So what does it mean that we currently find ourselves in a paradigm where somebody can present these ideas to a room full of people with standing room only and receive thunderous applause in response? Personally, I think it means that we're at a point where critical examination and analysis has been replaced with unreasonably optimistic platitudes and cliches. This sort of ideation is dangerous precisely because it subverts people who've had experiences that lead them to conclude there are problems in the world that require direct action to mitigate. This, in turn, offers false reassurances that everything is okay. Additionally, I don't think it's a coincidence that most of the personalities behind these frameworks are pushing modalities where they're front and center, offering solutions or at least analysis in the forms of pricey books, lectures, and especially retreats. It seems almost ironic to follow up this particular anecdote with the assertion that psychedelics can affect radical understandings in ourselves and about the world around us. Perhaps some people would even suggest that the story I just shared relates that of a psychedelic celebrity who had indeed undergone a radical shift in cognition, perhaps induced by psychedelics. However, we should understand the term radical not as the meaningless buzzword that appears in the press, but as meaning of, relating to, or proceeding from the root. The assertion that psychedelics can facilitate radical understandings about ourselves and the world around us means that these plants and experiences can help us examine the underlying causes and root mechanisms of the systems of domination responsible for industrial capitalism and ecocide. As I've shared elsewhere, this was made apparent to me during my first mushroom experience. During this trip, I experienced the entirety of life in a small patch of forest as intertwined and inseparable from myself. This led me to reflect on corporations literally engaged in acts of for-profit insanity, poisoning the air we breathe, the water we drink, and the ground we derive sustenance from, and to realize that food, clothes, and shelter are locked into this global paradigm. I realized that I couldn't remove myself from the system without also criminalizing myself, as vagrancy and homelessness are criminalized acts, and land, which was at one point the global commons, has been roped off by people with superior resources and declared off limits to everyone else. Participating in industrial economies is both coerced and destructive. I can't opt out, and even if I did, it wouldn't have a tangible effect, as my minuscule purchasing power is irrelevant. People who talk about voting with their dollars forget that this is for people who have dollars in the first place. Ultimately, this experience led me to the conclusion that my only option is to resist. The logic of capitalism is a race to the bottom that seeks to commodify and incorporate the entirety of existence into capitalist enterprise. Attached to this logic are the implements of industrial civilization, which are destroying global ecosystems at truly alarming rates. Even if I could opt out, it wouldn't do anything to save me or other life on this planet in the event that these destructive processes obliterate the life support systems on spaceship Earth. The logic of capitalism dictates that it won't stop on its own, as stopping isn't profitable. Thus, resistance is necessary. Because these realizations were part of my introduction to psychedelics, they've always seemed antithetical to systems of state and capital to me. That said, I'm frequently reminded that for many people, this simply isn't the case. For example, this past spring, I heard one psychedelic celebrity comment that they envision a world where Putin and Obama drink ayahuasca together and decide to end offensive wars, where corporations still exist but don't destroy the environment, where psychedelics allow our collective consciousness to elevate in harmony. When I asked what mechanisms would allow for states and corporations to exist without all of the environmental and human destruction they're predicated on, they informed me that there's contradiction in everything. All of us were likely wearing clothing made in sweatshops, and they personally fly around the world to give lectures on sustainability. However, the assertion that life is one big contradiction doesn't actually address the structural nature of states and corporations. For example, in the US, it's remarkably easy to demonstrate that the starting capital for American capitalism was secured through slavery and genocide. And if we examine the actions of the US government and American corporations over the past 250 years, we can easily identify a plethora of unambiguous atrocities. For a comprehensive rundown, I'd suggest Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States as a starting point. Dismissing the nature of states and corporations by asserting that psychedelics will somehow remove the horrific yet essential components of these institutions doesn't actually allow us to create meaningful strategies to address them. And honestly, even if beneficent states and corporations were attainable, it seems apparent that the potential for change offered by psychedelic experience transcends either capitalist or statist models. For example, the notion that everything is interconnected seems fundamentally at odds with systems that rely on coercion, commodification, borders, and private property. So utilizing psychedelic insight to reform rather than abolish inherently domineering institutions seems like a misapplication of the potential these experiences present. I think we can aim higher and use our insights to tie our aims to the really existing systems and institutions that we're going to have to deal with if we want to see real change. These broad assertions of psychedelic global paradigm shifts are accompanied by a smaller plethora of memes and psychedelic dogmas. While less comprehensive than the paradigm shift assertions, these smaller memes are no less troubling in the lack of analysis that they present. The current popularization of ayahuasca presents a prime opportunity for the examination of some of these types of ideas. Two of the most common notions that I've encountered are the assertion that ayahuasca should only be taken with a shaman and that it's disrespectful to extract the alkaloids from the plants used to make ayahuasca. I've been told by numerous people that shamans are necessary for working with ayahuasca for a number of reasons, including claiming that it's too potent a psychedelic to take alone, to this is how the indigenous do it in the Amazon, to asserting that it's disrespectful to drink without a shaman. In my opinion, none of these assertions holds up under scrutiny. As far as potency, ayahuasca isn't a standardized preparation, so it's hard to make any meaningful claims about it when talking in the abstract. It really comes down to the specific plants used in any particular brew. And for what it's worth, salvinorin A and LSD are both exponentially more potent than the vast majority, if not all of the plants used in ayahuasca. As to the notion that shamans are needed because this is how it's done by the indigenous in the Amazon, there's no such thing as an indigenous monoculture, and the geographical area that's being discussed stretches across numerous countries and regions. Talking about what the indigenous do as though they're some sort of singular entity doesn't match reality or do justice to the diversity of indigenous people. Not only do social arrangements and customs vary across groups and geographic regions, but the plants used to brew ayahuasca vary incredibly. Some people don't use any DMT-containing admixture in their brews, while other people might use very small amounts. Showing respect to plants, psychedelic preparations, or anything else has much more to do with my own attitude and approach than my choice to involve shamans or other people. After all, if I lack respect or proper intentions, how does involving someone else change that? At best, maybe they can serve as a mirror for me to recognize these deficits, but perhaps we have entirely different notions of what respect is or which intentions are proper. By all means, if you feel that you need or want a shaman, trust your instincts. But either way, it seems to me that entrusting these experiences to external sources is probably not the best way to ensure personal respect or intention. And this issue of respect is one that tends to accompany the assertion that you shouldn't extract the active components of ayahuasca because it's disrespectful to the plants. But what does that really mean? Ayahuasca is itself an aqueous extract of alkaloids from plant material. Plant material is added to water with the intention of pulling the alkaloids from the plant into the water. So does this mean we should eat the plants instead? What about the fact that the hydrochloric acid in our guts would then extract the alkaloids? The idea of respecting the plants starts to lose meaning when we attach it to dogmatically prescribed actions divorced from our understandings of the world around us. To underscore this point, consider an anecdote shared by Jonathan Ott at the Aya 2014 conference when he was specifically asked if pharmahuasca, or extracted ayahuasca alkaloids, lose part of the spirit of the plant or present a fundamentally different experience. Ott's response was that it's obvious to him that the pure compounds are the spirit of the plant in its purest, naked, crystalline form. He pointed out that traditionally, coca leaves are chewed, the alkaloid-laden saliva swallowed, and the leaves spat out. Glenn Shepard reinforced these sentiments, pointing out that the Matsugenka state that the spirit of the plant infuses the water used to make tea, and that the active compounds are the soul of the plant. Ott went on to illustrate his point.
I've never had any problem discussing this with shamans who were Castilian speakers, Once in Ecuador, in Hatunsacha, I had a small laboratory set up, and we were separating the alkaloids of Banisteriopsis potions with chacruna, or amiruca panca, they say there, Psychotria viridis, on thin layer plates with silica gel, and visualizing the alkaloids with a portable UV light. And they were really happy to see this, and they said, that's it. When I showed them the spots on the plate, they said, that's exactly it. And then suddenly I became an expert to them when I showed them those spots.
It bears mentioning that most, if not all of the people I've encountered spreading myths about potency, shamans, or extractions don't have traditional entheogenic practices or ties to them. I don't know any of your histories, but I don't have any roots in the indigenous cultures of Latin and South America. I don't have a context for their cultural practices or ceremonies or ontologies. I deeply appreciate the lineage that exists and has allowed me to experience ayahuasca, mushrooms, cacti, and other entheogens with long histories of traditional indigenous use. But for me, respect and appreciation doesn't mean trying to replicate things that are unfamiliar to me or creating arbitrary rules to enforce on others. Rather, respect means trying to find ways to incorporate these substances and experiences into my life and my own frames of reference in authentic and personally meaningful ways. So given that extraction and personal practice don't constitute disrespect vis-a-vis ayahuasca or other ethnobotanical preparations, and the frequency with which these ideas of disrespecting the plants or experiences comes up, it seems worthwhile to ask what disrespect might actually look like. In my opinion, this can be answered in one word: commodification. Psychedelic plants grow abundantly throughout the world, require minimal effort to cultivate, and can facilitate experiences that transcend and challenge ontological and epistemological frameworks, thereby rendering gatekeepers, gurus, or salespeople irrelevant. However, more pressing than the sheer illogicality of commodifying psychedelics are the plethora of real-world effects that accompanies their commodification, whether through biopiracy, poaching, market-based trade, or other means. The recent denunciation of Alberto José Varela and his company Ayahuasca International by the Cofan people of Colombia presents a glimpse into the increasingly widespread practices accompanying the commodification of ayahuasca and other ethnobotanicals. Two of the major assertions by the Cofan are that this organization has turned ayahuasca into a lucrative business, posing serious threats to the health and life of those who participate in these ceremonies, and that Ayahuasca International markets ayahuasca ceremonies by fraudulently alluding to supposed permission or approval from indigenous people. Ayahuasca International consists of a network of companies and internet presences that Varela refers to as the first multinational corporation dedicated to ayahuasca, and his business model employs aggressive marketing techniques, including large social media presences and significant investments in advertising in an attempt to commodify ayahuasca, generate market demand for these plants, and ultimately take advantage of the ignorance and naivete of many people. In an attempt to expand the scope of his business, he has given facilitators superficial courses through the European Ayahuasca School, ultimately resulting in people with little to no experience facilitating ayahuasca ceremonies. Unsurprisingly, a growing number of people have described reprehensible business and ceremonial practices. But it's worth noting that charlatans don't only try to mask their practices in notion of traditional indigenous practice. In the US, the psychedelic resurgence has led to the proliferation of lifestyle coaches paying psychedelic lip service in an attempt to maximize personal profit. Take, for example, this guru, located in California, who offers accelerated psychonaut packages, ranging from $95 for the self-starter kit to $1,350 for the platinum level plan, the so-called Maserati of all options. These plans include everything from Jedi trainings to seminars, webinars, certificates for unlocking your superpowers, and of course, promises of FaceTime with the guru. Perhaps the best thing that could be said about these types of profiteers is that their actions may harm less people than those of larger organizations such as Ayahuasca International. However, their practices are still predicated on preying on the naive and uninformed. And speaking of harm, commodification raises much more complicated issues. Take the recent explosion of interest in iboga. It's downright incredible that this plant exists and offers so much hope to people struggling with addiction, especially when we consider the profit motives behind governmentally sanctioned addiction facilities currently distributing methadone and Suboxone, and the financial incentives for both pharmaceutical companies and the government to perpetuate long-term cycles of prescribed opiate addiction. Iboga presents a fascinatingly disruptive potential, not only to cycles of addiction, but also to the literal commodification of addicts at the hands of the current system. Unfortunately, it's not so simple. Iboga isn't traditionally cultivated in its native habitat of Gabon, and it grows along paths where elephants walk as they eat the fruits from the plant and expel the seeds, and iboga populations are dwindling. As people from industrial contexts have learned of the incredible potential of this plant and have fueled widespread poaching of the root bark, we've seen significant deforestation in pursuit of this plant. I've personally met people running iboga clinics who can't tell me where their root bark is coming from, but they tell me that I shouldn't worry because it's providing tremendous relief to their patients. I have to admit, I don't feel particularly relieved that these individuals feel comfortable not questioning the ecological costs of their healthcare. For me, I think this notion of trust me, I'm an expert, is where the DIY ethos of the underground really starts to diverge from the more visible characters and celebrity personas of the expanding psychedelic scene. Part of this likely has to do with the formats for engagement, interpersonal and large and small-scale discussions, versus private seminars and lecture-style formats with brief Q&A at the end. We've had about 50 years of sanctioned psychedelic lectures, and I think it would be interesting to see what more communal modes of discourse might look like, even if they are messier than lecture presentations. None of us have a corner on the truth. We all have our own observations and experiences, and I think the collective body of knowledge could provide more insight than individual theories. That said, I don't think it's enough to simply change the format for how psychedelics are discussed publicly. The fact that there is obvious pushback throughout the underground against many of the mainstream takes on psychedelics indicates that these differences are not merely cosmetic. So what does it mean when communities on the cutting edge of working with these substances are in stark disagreement with some of the popular faces of the so-called psychedelic community? At the very least, I think it indicates a need for frank discussion about major issues, both in public and private forums, as part of our personal and public discourse with psychedelic family, friends, and acquaintances. The two biggest challenges to my mind are working to end, or at least minimize, the commodification of psychedelic compounds and cultures, and holding each other accountable for our psychedelically fueled ideation when we make assertions tied to broader human issues. I don't have a comprehensive idea of what it looks like to address these issues, largely because I think that what addressing them looks like depends on personal situations and individual relationships. I'm happy to throw out some food for thought, but ultimately, I think that this is something that we all have to engage with, and I'd like to see diverse strategies and ideas. Regarding decommodification, the simplest action might be to grow and extract your own ethnobotanicals. I'd urge anyone interested in this to check out the DMT Nexus, as well as sharetheseeds.me, a community of experienced enthusiasts, semi-professional, and professional botanists. Also, ask what you can do for psychedelic science. There are currently organizations that seem focused on telling us that the best contributions we can make to psychedelic research are financial. I'd counter that there's a wide variety of research available to non-sanctioned psychedelic researchers. For folks interested in this, I'd suggest checking out the DMT Nexus, specifically the collaborative research project where we've carried out plant analysis that's literally on the cutting edge of phytochemical research. What it looks like to remove psychedelics from the arena of commodities is by no means a clear-cut picture, and I think it will likely take all of us working together through a diversity of tactics in order to gain traction in this arena. Holding each other accountable for the psychedelic theories we put out into the world is as simple as practicing it. For example, if someone insists on mapping DMT experiences onto Kabbalistic Judaism, ask them why. Even if they tell you they're only willing to have this conversation with you when you're fluent in biblical Hebrew and have read all of the associated texts and rabbinical commentaries, their answer will still be illuminating for you and anyone else who gets to hear it. If someone is proposing visions of beautiful psychedelic futures, ask them how they plan on getting there. Hell, even if it's just you and your friends discussing a trip during the afterglow, consider exploring the critical and philosophical depths if it makes sense. We're more than half a century into the industrial exploration of psychedelics. That's more than 50 years of hope and promise tacked onto these plants and compounds. And who knows if we even have another 50 years to play around with. Ultimately, all of us in attendance represent cross-sections of psychedelic cultures. Each of us carries a responsibility to ourselves and to each other with regards to the discourse and actions taking place in broader psychedelic communities. If we really believe psychedelics are agents for change, let's make some changes. Thank you.